Okay, so we welcome now Nelson Ferreira because he's going to speak to us about the language of the farm in Latin instruction using semiotics for approaching ancient silent people. Who is Nelson Ferreira? Dr. Nelson Ferreira is a researcher and science manager at the University of Coimbra and has been studying and publishing within the scope of Mesopotamian and Mediterranean regions' popular culture, literatures, and ancient thought. Recently, his research has been dedicated to the anthropological impact of the economic dependence of agricultural production in Sumerian and Roman cultures and to the history of science. He has a PhD in classical studies from the University of Coimbra and in linguistic, literary, and cultural studies from the University of Barcelona. Welcome, Dr. Ferreira.
Thank you very much for the presentation. First of all, I would like to thank to the organization for accepting my paper, and also to apologize for not being able to be on the previous sessions during the previous days, as I was traveling, and unfortunately I lost my plane, so I couldn't arrive on time. So let's start. I will just share. I think that I have the permissions to share. Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to find the PowerPoint and I'm not being able. Maybe I don't know why it is not appearing the option to share only the PowerPoint. I will share my screen if it's okay. Then if it's not working, if someone can just warn me.
Yes, Samuel said it's okay. You can share your screen. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So I will do that. So can you see it?
Yes, okay. I can.
Okay, great. So without further delay, many Roman writers were eager to show that the life of the peasant farmer had molded the character of the Roman people and was personified by their heroes and their people. And I will argue that the construction of idealization came from traditional and popular thinking and was not artificially composed from scratch by the political propaganda of the Roman lords. This does not mean that there is no evidence of propaganda, but that the symbolic value was constructed from prototyped ideas already established in a cultural matrix. The aristocracy, the Roman aristocracy, did not create the symbols, but merely interpreted them for a specific aim. Literature absorbed those symbols, and consequently, a way to understand the Roman traditional voice may be found in the artificiality of literature. In fact, Roman thought associated with the agricultural cosmos must be reconsidered regarding empirical practices, literature, and popular traditions, and certain questions should be addressed, such as would is the community thought aligned with the way in which metaphors were constructed? Would the rustic Romans have independently constructed value from the same kind of abstract images and have intuitively understood their meanings? Is literature in some way connected with the real thought and abstract ideas of Latin speakers? I would claim that the last two questions can be answered affirmatively, since simple symbols seems to be camouflaged within complex literary compositions. Obviously, the answer to the first question is a matter of a guesswork and theoretical hypothesis. Nonetheless, I will argue here that the answer will also be a yes. For example, the farmer may constitute one of the most basic and generalized cultural symbols, as the great man who builds his own property, faces hardships, and produces his wealth with his own hands. But how is this general image constructed. Is this based on deep philosophical inquiry? Well, if we consider the real source of this meaning, that is to say, the empirical practice of farming activity and its manifestation on the landscape, one would find that it is not necessary much inquiring for getting that meaning, and semiotics can help us to see it. And this would be how. First, one must consider all the objects on the frame, or image, or landscape, and its immediate meaning as an object. Each object would correspond at least to one sign of meaning. For example, considering the natural frame of the plow from Colomella's words. Here is the text. Can you see the text? Just for checking.
I can see. Yes, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. In order to understand the meaning of this paragraph, besides knowing Latin, one needs to understand what the work of the plow implies, and for that, interlocutor needs to have pre-acquired the frame of the plow and its signs as the following. That is to say, earth or dirt where the plow is inserted, the animal pushing it, the action or movement applied to the soil, and the human motion. So one has at least 4 signs of meaning. In fact, one could find even more in an image such as this. This is what one sees when looking into the empirical practice of working the fields. So it is what one remembers when the image or part of it is called upon in language, despite being a metaphor or an objective reference. Then, from the signs of meaning crystallized on thought, the interlocutor will automatically select those that compound a complex symbol. The complex symbol is dependent on interpretation by the receiver, but the signs of meaning that compound it are not. Finally, the interlocutor will associate an empirical practice to the complex symbol, in this case, the hard worker and user of a skill. In this sense, it can be said that work with a plow would have been considered a dignified activity in abstract terms, here returning to what Colomel said. And the person needed by the state could only be found in the farms of Latium. This idealization was noted by Colomella when he quoted Varro on the same matter. Marcos Varro complained about the abandonment of the plow, saying that it could corrupt society, as people moved inside the city walls and used their hands for the pleasures of circuses and theaters rather than in the grain fields and vineyards. The plow would have represented the nobility of the man committed to his duties, despite the implied harshness of this way of living. Colomella reiterates this idea, stating that those who feel protected within the walls are considered lazier than those qui rura colerent, who work the fields. These citizens seem to be out of touch with work and nature, which means they have lost contact with the teachings of farming. Agricultural labor builds morality. Of course, this is a potential philosophical theme, since the image formed by a compounding of sense and meaning could not be extended so directly to the concept of morality. It is important to bear in mind that morality is a highly speculative concept which depends on controlled context and in which idealization plays a major role. Summing up, these are the signs and symbols one can find on the farmer's landscape in Latin instructions. And by Latin instructions, by the way, I think I didn't mention, I'm considering only Colomella's work, Varro's, and Cato's. And Liv and Virgil, Georgica, we could debate it if it is an instruction or not out of the commentary. So regarding this list, I just want to make a quick note. The idea of action and motion was not considered for these lists, as it is a sign broadly extended in the communication through verbal system and tendentially is always implied in dynamic landscapes. So on the left, we have the signs of meaning, and on the right, the symbols that can be created through compounding those signs. For each sign, it was identify a possible symbol it can compound. Of course, the list can be much higher than this one. And here a list of references where those can be seen clearly. Just if anyone is interested, I can provide a more extended list. This is just a short selection. Now, considering to the specific context of the plow, one must note the symbiosis on the landscape between person, plow, and animal. So here is the list of signs that one can find in this more specific landscape of the plow, I mean. Here I've included some of the signs that are also found on the shepherd's image as they are shared, meaning the conductor of the plow and the shepherd. It can be said that the farmer was a model of virtue in the popular mind. This virtue was not inherent to the man, but came from the occupation and the tasks that prevent alienation. Just to summing up what is being said so far by Varro and Colomella. The man does not bring nobility to farming, it is agriculture that fosters virtue in the man. Cato presents a sententious summary in terms of the virtue created from the rural life. In fact, farmer is the stereotype of the honest and the virtuous man whose wealth is the fruit of his own work and comes from interaction with nature. Varro notes the same value, recalling the traditional comparison between the Roman countryside and the city. Romans living in urban spaces, as I said before, are lazier than those working in the fields. Moreover, for the Roman aristocracy, a good man also had to be a good soldier, and this seems to be guaranteed by agricultural life. The aiming of my commentary is not necessarily to talk about the symbol of the farmer or if it is real or not regarding the Roman context, but how it is constructed, and this idea of morality as well, from visual markers in the landscape, how they are used in order to compound complex cultural symbolic representations. As the fact that the farmer's subsistence comes from his own labor and his ability to produce directly from work without harm to the other man favors the image of the nobility of this activity. The instructional text would have reflected, and here I include these three, but I could include more, would have reflected intellectuality and sense of duty of the author. As a citizen working for Roman society, the writers of this kind of text would have been recognized as leading intellectual and literary figures. Pliny the Elder, for example, notes that kings also wrote about agriculture. Recognition has moral and intellectual connotations, since the higher the status, the higher the moral requirements would have been, and consequently, an individual dedicated to such an activity had to be exceptional. Pliny identifies instruction as a high status genre by referring to the great names famed for other activities who still paid attention to agriculture, such as the Greek Xenophon, for example, a famous historian and warrior. It seems likely that this was identified with plenitude as a reflection of a man's wisdom associated with natural phenomena. Also, it points out to the economic social value of farming and its deep roots in cultural constructions, not only Latin, but around all the Mediterranean. I just make this short commentary on instructions to underline the perception by societies of agricultural value, and so of knowledge on farming and the value of those who perform these tasks. If those tasks and if agriculture has so much value, it will be highly presented in the collective imagery, in the abstract thought, so it will be optimal resources for linguistic construction. Now, thinking on a landscape without a human as a part of its frame, the value for irrigation is a key characteristic mentioned in Colomella's instructions. And if there is any identification of a specific characteristic, the potential for a sign of meaning is also there. since the sign is originated from a characteristic identified by seeing. Once one can determine the image Columella took as his reference, its signs of meaning can be identified, and the inverse can also be performed. The authors of the Latin instructions must have had real landscapes in mind for their teachings to have been considered as reliable. In this sense, technical and descriptive information on agriculture is source for the thoughts of the community. The imperative need for water in agricultural landscape is commonly reflected on language, which evokes aspects of signs of meaning for water, such potential absence of water, that is to say, dryness. Lack of water can lead to great disasters, as the community knew well. Hence, there is a meaning in a landscape with no water. So this kind of assumption is based on the logical association between a hypothetical landscape composed of all the signs of meaning that make it optimal for human life and the potential realities in which the signs of meaning are subtracted from the hypothetical image, leaving a visual result that acquires meaning from the preconceived ideas of the interlocutor. For example, the image of a green plain with a small spring contains the signs of meaning for growth, water, fluidity, and drink/irrigation. If the spring is subtracted from the image, all the signs constructed from the spring will also disappear, and the interlocutor will identify a different semantic imagery, an inverse a semantic imagery that stands for dryness. Consider another example as a flood from a river. One would have the following symbol production. Summing up, the following are the signs of meaning and symbols from water's landscape. I'm sorry, as I'm running out of time, I'm just going directly to the summing up of the symbols and the signs identified in many texts, and then the list of reference one may find with those. There are some of the references. There are more, by the way. Here, it's particularly interesting to notice that that water is not so refer as we would expect in Colomella's work. It is highly refer, but we are talking about a really big work where water was in the type of agriculture produced by Romans would be expected to appear more. But this is just a note that in fact has nothing to do with this presentation. There is a tendency for images generated from riverine landscapes to ground abstract signs that could be compounded into conceptual or abstract symbols. For example, when Varro refers to apiculture, he uses the image of a bunch of grapes to identify the form, consistency, and distribution of the bees at the entrance of the hive, and thus conceptualize a behavior sign for bees through an understandable analogy with a common fruit, which enables the beekeeper to recognize when the hive has too many bees or a new colony can be created. The image is vivid and clear. Its more profound or metaphoric meaning is not so much a matter of spontaneous understanding, but the physical form is perceptible and the analogy is easy to grasp. Everyone would have known what a bunch of grapes look like. This emphasizes the value of the image in terms of generating meaning through signs that are crystallized in popular thought. In this sense, abstract concepts such as abundance can be constructed simply by presenting an image of growth or diversity. In the Latin instructional text on farming, one can infer that it was known that different regions and environments produce specific crops, depending on the richness of the soil. This is empirical knowledge and apparently has little to do with traditional thought in abstract language. However, it states an obvious idea: richness in contrast with soil that are potentially poor. Farming is an aspect of the natural world, since it is constructed from nature itself, that is to say, poverty and richness, reflected in production. may be expressed through different aspects of the rural cosmos, such as the soil characteristics associated with a specific type of production, as in this case. In fact, this is an important element of symbolic constructions based on visual landscapes. Well, those are quite short examples that do not show all the spectrum of signs of meaning that can be found regarding landscapes of production. But here is the sum up of the signs and symbols that can be constructed from those. Again, as we are a little bit running of time, I cannot provide many textual examples, but I just add the sum up of those in this following table. Again, if anyone wants the list, the more expanded list, I can provide it with no problem. Okay, as conclusion, instructions on agriculture are available to find out the signs of meaning because, in order to be accurate, they bring a reality that is closer of the environment and landscape of the rural world. So the image there is accurate, allowing us to extract signs of meaning from it. Those signs of meaning are the constituent elements of abstract language. So one can be closer of the daily life language just by looking into the landscape where Asian people lived, and from that understand the way symbols are constructed. Then one can use the literary sources as resources for studying the thought of those of the past who in fact are silent to history. But they were the majority of population and also were the basis for all cultural frames. Summing up, recovering landscapes to know the spectrum of symbolic language Asian people had to communicate in a universal standard is to reach the minds of Asian societies. Thank you.